Christmas Eve, 1975, Winter Garden, Florida. Police respond to a call for help at the W.T. Zeigler Furniture Store and find one of the store's owners, Tommy Zeigler, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Inside, they discover that 4 people have been murdered: Tommy's wife Eunice Zeigler, her parents Perry and Virginia Edwards, and a customer named Charlie Mays. Tommy claims that he was attacked and shot by unknown intruders, but authorities believe that Tommy committed the murders himself and that his gunshot wound is self-inflicted. Months later, he is put on trial and sentenced to death. Over the years, evidence has emerged to cast doubt on the conviction and suggest that an innocent man has been on death row for the past 40 years. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 15 of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and I can safely say that today's episode is going to be our longest, most convoluted one to date. You're probably very familiar with the podcast Serial, which has played a huge role in making true crime podcasts so popular in recent years. As you recall, Serial examined the 1999 murder of a girl named Hai Min Lee, and cast doubt on whether Adnan Syed, the young man convicted of her murder, actually committed the crime. Due to the mammoth publicity this case has received, Adnan Syed has recently been awarded a new trial. So I thought it was about time that The Trail Went Cold did its own Serial-style episode about a case which is technically solved, but is fraught with doubt over the resolution. Today, I am going to be examining the case of Tommy Zeigler, a man who was convicted of 4 brutal murders and has been on death row for the past 40 years. If you're wondering why a man would be kept on death row for 40 years without being executed, that's because this case is very controversial and the state of Florida has always been very worried about the potential backlash they'd receive if they actually went through with Zeigler's execution. This case is actually a listener request from one of the top posters from the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, who goes by the handle The Cars 1986. The Cars 1986 has always been a big supporter of this podcast and someone who has delved very deep into the Tommy Zeigler case, so I was quite happy to tackle this one. There's actually a mammoth thread about it at the Unsolved Mysteries message board, and I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of posters from that thread who have discussed this case in depth, including The Cars 1986, Mozart PC27, who has written some very detailed posts and analysis which have been a valuable resource for helping me keep all the information straight, and Killarney Rose, who actually grew up in Winter Garden, Florida, where this story takes place, and provided an interesting perspective about how this crime affected the community. This case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1997 as one of their final appeal stories, and all things considered, it's nothing short of a miracle that they were able to condense this entire story into one 15-minute segment. This is undoubtedly one of the most complex and fascinating murder cases I've ever come across. Tommy Zeigler has a slew of supporters who are still fighting to get him out of prison, so I was excited for the challenge of taking this one on. But be warned, however, this is definitely going to be our longest episode to date. In fact, this case is so complex that we're actually going to make this our very first 2-part episode, because otherwise we'd never be able to have this episode finished in time for our release date. But not to worry, instead of waiting the usual 2 weeks, you're only going to have to wait 1 week before we post part 2. I'm not joking when I say that someone could easily do an entire Serial-style podcast about this story, spanning 12, 13 episodes. If I were to cover every single piece of information in this case, we'd probably be here for days, but I think I've done my best to cover all the essentials. But before we get started, I've got a very special announcement to make. We've had a lot of requests for The Trail Went Cold to become a weekly podcast and provide more content, which is something we'd really love to do. But my editor McGill and I, we both work regular day jobs, so for the moment at least, our schedules probably wouldn't allow us to produce a full-length episode every week. However, we've come up with what we feel is a suitable compromise: minisodes. There are some interesting cold cases I've been wanting to cover on The Trail Went Cold, but the problem is that they just don't have enough material to fill a 30 to 40 minute episode, and I don't want to shortchange the audience. These cases do have enough material for a 10 to 15 minute minisode, so starting in September, The Trail Went Cold is going to become a weekly podcast, as we will be alternating between our regular full-length episodes about the more extensive cases and 10 to 15 minute minisodes about cases which don't have as many details. We feel this is a good way to provide our listeners with weekly content and provide exposure for more cold cases. So you won't have to wait 2 weeks to hear from us again. The week after we present part 2 of the Tommy Zeigler story, we will be delivering our very first minisode. This is our way of saying thank you to all our listeners and supporters out there, because we wouldn't have made it this far without you. Just a reminder that The Trail Went Cold is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would be incredibly flattered and greatly appreciate it. We'll be sure to give any of our generous donors a shout out on a future episode. We've recently gotten quite a few donations, including from some listeners named Michael and Lynn. So thank you very much, folks. We are very humbled by your generosity. So with that out of the way, it is now time to delve into the enormous rabbit hole, which is the Tommy Zeigler case. Our story begins on Christmas Eve in 1975 in the town of Winter Garden, Florida. Our central figure is 30-year-old William Thomas Zeigler Jr., who goes by the name Tommy. Tommy works at W.T. Zeigler Furniture, a store which is owned by his parents and has been a fixture in the community for 36 years. The Zeigler family is very well off, as in addition to the furniture store, they also own several apartment buildings in the area and are worth over $1 million at this point. Tommy's wife is 32-year-old Eunice Zeigler, who originally hails from the town of Moultrie, Georgia, and the couple has been married for 8 years. On this particular night, Eunice's parents, Perry and Virginia Edwards, have traveled down from Georgia to spend the holidays with their daughter and son-in-law. When Christmas Eve arrives, Tommy spends the day working at the furniture store until it closes at around 6 p.m. Tommy and Eunice are planning to bring the Edwards back to the store in about an hour so they can pick out a recliner as a Christmas gift. After that, Eunice, Perry, and Virginia will attend a church service until 8:30, and then Eunice and Tommy will head off to the Christmas party. After the store closes, Tommy has one of the employees from his store, Curtis Dunaway, follow him back to his home. Dunaway is planning to travel to Orlando for a family gathering on Christmas Day, but his Oldsmobile has been experiencing car trouble. Earlier that day, Tommy offered to switch vehicles with Dunaway so that he wouldn't run the risk of having his Oldsmobile break down during his trip to Orlando. Dunaway is invited into the Zeigler home, and he claims that everyone there, from Tommy to Eunice to her parents, appears to be in great spirits. He then switches cars with Tommy and drives off. Sometime around 7 p.m., Eunice and her parents travel to the furniture store to pick out the recliner. And over the course of the next 2.5 hours, events would transpire which have been analyzed and heavily debated for the past 40 years. At around 9:18, the host of the Christmas party the Zeiglers were planning to attend received a phone call from Tommy, who asked to speak to one of the guests, Don Fickey. Fickey was one of Tommy's closest friends and just happened to be the town's police chief. When Fickey took the call, Tommy frantically told him that he'd been attacked at his store and was shot, so police were immediately dispatched to the scene. When they arrived several minutes later, they found Tommy stumbling out through the store's entrance with a gunshot wound in his abdomen, so he was instantly rushed to the hospital. Police entered the store, which was completely dark because the power had been turned off. They soon discovered that a complete massacre had taken place. There were 4 dead bodies there, and they were all located in different sections of the store. Eunice Zeigler's body was lying near the entrance to the kitchen, and she had been shot through the back of the head. Virginia Edwards' body was discovered near the front of the store, where she had been shot twice. Perry Edwards was found dead at the rear of the store in the showroom, and not only had he been shot 5 times, but he was also seriously beaten about the head. Curiously, they also found a 4th body about 15 yards away from Perry, a black man who had been shot twice and also seriously beaten about the head. He was identified as Charlie Mays, who worked as a foreman for a fruit-picking crew in the citrus orchards of Orange County, and he was also a regular customer at the furniture store. A metal linoleum crank, which had been used to beat both Mays and Perry Edwards, was discovered near his body. Over $400 in cash and $400 in store receipt slips were found in Mays' pocket, and his van was parked behind the store in the rear lot of the adjacent Winter Garden Inn. Earlier that day, Mays and his wife had visited the store to purchase some linoleum. According to Mrs. Mays, her husband had made an arrangement to meet Tommy at the store that night after closing to pick up a television set on credit, which he was going to present to their kids as a surprise Christmas gift. The Edwards' sedan was parked in front of the store, and a pickup truck was parked in the loading bay. The truck was registered to Edward Williams, a local black man who worked as a part-time handyman and delivery person for the furniture store. But Williams himself was nowhere to be found. The murder scene was a colossal mess, as 5 separate handguns were found scattered throughout the store, and it was estimated that a total of 28 shots had been fired. So the obvious question was, what the hell happened? Well, here's where the case undergoes what could best be described as the Rashomon Effect. If you're not familiar with that term, Rashomon happens to be the title of a classic Japanese film directed by Akira Kurosawa. The narrative features a series of events told from the separate points of view of multiple characters, but of course, in each retelling of the story, the details are totally different. The title of the film would eventually become the source of its own phrase, the Rashomon Effect, which is used to describe contradictory interpretations of the same event from different people. And that phrase certainly applies to this case. I'm now going to be describing multiple versions of the events which took place between 7 o'clock and 9:18 p.m. on the night of the murders. Each version has been shared by a different individual, and they all provide different interpretations. And quite frankly, I have no idea if any of these versions are the complete truth about what really happened that night. So we'll start with the version of events provided by Tommy Zeigler, and keep in mind that he has continuously stuck to this story for the past 40 years. Okay, so according to Tommy, Eunice and her parents left together in their sedan for the furniture store while he waited at the house for Edward Williams. Earlier that day, Tommy had made arrangements with Williams to help him make a few last-minute deliveries from the furniture store before he and Eunice went to the Christmas party. Williams was supposed to meet Tommy at his home at 7 p.m., but after 10 to 15 minutes he hadn't shown up. Since he was running late, Tommy decided to leave a note for Williams on the door and drive to a nearby store to pick up some bourbon for the party. However, when he was about halfway there, Tommy realized that purchasing the bourbon would only set him further behind, so he decided to turn back and return to the house. By the time he got there, Williams had already arrived, so they drove to the furniture store together in Williams' pickup truck. When they arrived, they pulled into the fenced-in back lot, and Tommy locked the gate behind them. Tommy then walked into the store, while Williams backed up his truck to the loading bay door. Tommy saw that the store was completely dark and tried to turn on the lights, but they did not work because the power had been turned off. All of a sudden, he was hit in the back of the head and attacked by a pair of unknown assailants, causing his glasses to fall off. Combined with the darkness and the loss of his glasses, Tommy could not see who his attackers were and described them as blurs. He had a .22 automatic on him at the time, so he pulled it out of his holster and fired it at his assailants, but the gun jammed. After throwing the gun at his attackers, Tommy continued to struggle with them, and they eventually wound up throwing him about the store. Tommy soon wound up in the hallway, but he was able to make it to his desk and reach inside his drawer, where he grabbed a .357 Magnum he kept stored there. He fired off a few shots before the gun was knocked from his hand and he was thrown into a rug rack. Tommy then claims he was shot in the abdomen and fell to the floor. Before he lost consciousness, he thought he saw a third blurry figure and heard his attackers say things like, "We've got to dispose of Mays, he's been hit, we can't take him with us," and "Kill him, he's no good to us." When Tommy awoke, he made it to the phone and called the Christmas party in order to speak to Chief Don Fickey. After finishing the call, Tommy walks to the front door and stumbles outside when the police arrive. He claims he never came across the bodies of his wife or his in-laws and did not even learn they'd been murdered until after he was taken to the hospital. And he also had no idea what happened to Edward Williams after he was attacked. So on the surface, it seemed like Tommy had walked into the store in the middle of a robbery. Since Charlie Mays was found with cash and store receipts in his pocket, it's possible he was involved and that Tommy wounded him when he fired off his .357 Magnum. If the words Tommy overheard from his attackers are accurate, Mays' accomplices probably finished him off to avoid taking him to a hospital. Well, right from the outset, the lead investigator on the case, Don Fry, had doubts about Tommy's story. There were many reasons for this, but one piece of physical evidence he found suspicious was Tommy's holster, which was discovered on top of Mays' blood spatters. There was no blood on the holster, which means the spatters had to already have been dry when the holster ended up there. There also appeared to be a trail of blood leading from the telephone to the front door. Fry thought that Tommy might have inflicted his gunshot wound on himself after his phone call to Chief Fickey. His suspicions were soon affirmed when a black man named Felton Thomas surfaced. At around 2:30 a.m. on Christmas morning, Felton Thomas turned himself into the police and provided a crazy story which I guess we'll call version number 2 of the events from that night. Thomas worked as a fruit picker on Charlie Mays' crew and claimed he was having an ordinary Christmas Eve until Mays approached him, asking him if he would accompany him in his van to Zeigler Furniture. Mays told Thomas that he had made arrangements to pick up a television set at the store after closing and needed Thomas's assistance with moving the TV into his home. So the two men drove to the store and parked the van in the rear lot of the adjacent Winter Garden Inn. Thomas notices that the store is completely dark at this point, and the Edwards' sedan is parked out front. It isn't long before a white man drove up in a light-colored Cadillac to meet them. Thomas would identify this man as Tommy Zeigler, though he claimed he'd never met him before this night. Zeigler tells Mays that the store is locked, but that someone is supposed to drop by and give him the keys. In the meantime, Zeigler wants to know if Mays and Thomas would like to accompany him somewhere, so he can show them something. Both men agree, so they climb into Zeigler's car and drive to a nearby orange grove. It's here that Zeigler pulls out 3 brand new guns, which he claims he has recently bought. He asks Mays and Thomas if they would like to try them out. They both take him up on his offer and fire a couple of shots into the orange grove. They then drive back to the store, but Zeigler becomes frustrated because the person who is supposed to deliver the keys hasn't arrived yet. So he asks Thomas to pull the electrical switch to turn off the store's power, which Thomas does. And then Zeigler decides that maybe they should break into the place. Zeigler picks up a pipe to break one of the store's rear windows, but Mays expresses his discomfort at breaking into the place. Zeigler then decides against it and remembers that he might have an extra key at his house. So the 3 men climb into the car and drive to the Zeigler home, which is only a couple of blocks away, and pull into the driveway. It's here that Thomas remembers seeing a car parked in the driveway. Zeigler enters the garage and returns with an extra key, but he is also carrying a box of bullets with him. As they drive back to the store, Zeigler asks Mays to take the bullets out of the box and reload the guns. When they arrive, Zeigler asks Mays to accompany him into the store through the front door, but by this point, Thomas has grown very uneasy about Zeigler's behavior. After Mays walks inside, Zeigler invites Thomas to come in, but Thomas does not like the idea of walking into a completely dark store with this complete stranger. So Thomas exits the vehicle and just takes off. At around 8:30, he bumps into a friend of his at a nearby mall who then drives him to the town of Oakland. Several hours later, Thomas hears that Mays and a bunch of other people in the store have been murdered, so he decides to turn himself into the police. And it's at around this exact same time that the conspicuously missing Edward Williams resurfaces to also turn himself into the police. Believe it or not, Williams provides the police with an empty .38 revolver, and it turns out this exact weapon was used to fire bullets into the heads of Perry and Virginia Edwards. The guy's got one of the murder weapons in his possession, and his truck is parked behind the furniture store, so you'd think the cops would absolutely throw the book at Williams, right? Not quite. Williams claims he had nothing to do with the murders, and provides the police with version number 3 of the events from that night. Remember how Tommy Zeigler said that Williams was supposed to meet him at his house at 7 p.m. to help him make some deliveries? Well, Williams claims the meeting was not supposed to happen until 7:30. When Williams arrived, Zeigler wasn't there, but he left a note on the door stating he'd be right back. 10 minutes later, Zeigler pulls into the driveway in Curtis Dunaway's car, and Williams sees that he has 2 black male passengers with him, whom we can only assume are Charlie Mays and Felton Thomas. Zeigler quickly goes in and out of the house and asks Williams if he can wait 10 more minutes. Zeigler then leaves again, but stays gone for quite a while. At around 8 p.m., Williams remembers seeing a white couple briefly pull into the driveway before they turn around and leave, but he isn't sure who they are. Anyway, Zeigler does not return to the house until around 8:25 or so, and he parked Dunaway's car in the garage. Williams sees Zeigler washing his hands in the garage sink, wiping down the car, and notices what appears to be a stain on his pants. Anyway, Zeigler climbs into Williams' pickup truck, and they both drive to the furniture store. At around 8:40, they park behind the store in a fenced-in back area, and Zeigler locks the gate behind them. Zeigler enters the store through the rear door, while Williams takes a moment to urinate outside, which kind of seems like a strange thing to do, considering that there were washrooms inside the store. But anyway, Williams finally goes inside and sees that the place is completely dark. It's here that Zeigler suddenly jumps out and appears to fire 3 shots at Williams from a .38 revolver, but it only makes a loud popping sound, possibly because the gun is either empty or jammed. Of course, Williams freaks out and runs outside. Zeigler then appears in the doorway and apologizes, assuring Williams that he thought he was someone else and that it was all a big misunderstanding. He then places the .38 in Williams' hand to put him at ease, and tries to convince him to come back in the store. Williams tells Zeigler that he will come back inside if Zeigler will unlock the gate. Zeigler agrees, but when his back is turned, Williams takes off in the opposite direction and then climbs over the 6-foot chain-link fence into the parking lot of the Winter Garden Inn. He then hightails it across the street and walks into a Kentucky Fried Chicken, where he asks one of the employees if he can use their office phone, and he also asks them for the number of the police. According to Williams, the employee let him use the phone and gave him the police's number, but when Williams dialed it, the number turned out to be wrong. Williams then decides to exit the KFC, and by pure chance, he bumps into 2 women he knows. He asks them for a ride out of the area, and he eventually winds up in Orlando. Williams spends the next few hours hiding out at the home of a friend named Mary Ellen Stewart, before he decides to contact the police and turn himself in. After all this, Williams still has the .38 Zeigler gave him in his pocket, so he gives it to the police, and he also turns over all the clothing he wore that night as evidence. If that wasn't enough, there's also a version number 4 of these events, or maybe I should call it version number 3.5 since it's only a partial account. But version number 3.5 seems to throw everything out of whack. Anyway, that night, Tommy and Eunice were supposed to meet Chief Don Fickey and his wife Rita at their home to accompany them to the Christmas party. When Tommy and Eunice didn't show up, the Fickeys decided to drive to the Zeigler home. They claimed they showed up at around 8:10 and pulled into the driveway, but saw no one there and left. They said they returned at about 8:35 and there was still no one there, but this time they saw a pickup truck in the driveway which matched the description of Ed Williams' truck. Don Fickey went up to the front door to knock on it and claimed he saw a black man inside the pickup truck as he walked past it. When no one answered the door, the Fickeys left again and returned 10 minutes later, and this time they said the pickup truck was gone and Curtis Dunaway's Oldsmobile was now parked in the garage. After this, the Fickeys gave up on meeting with the Zeiglers and decided to drive to the Christmas party by themselves, where they remained until Don Fickey received the phone call from Tommy at 9:18. So the big issue here is that the Fickeys' timeline does not completely mesh with either Tommy Zeigler's or Edward Williams' timeline. You might remember that Williams claimed he saw a white couple pulling into the driveway while he was waiting outside the Zeigler home. You'd assume this couple would be the Fickeys, but the problem is that Williams only mentioned seeing them once, even though they would have shown up twice during the time he was supposed to be there. In fact, Williams made no mention at all of Fickey walking up to the front door to knock on it, even though Fickey claimed he walked past a black man sitting in the pickup truck. They did not actually remember seeing it there the first time they pulled into the driveway at 8:10, which is when Williams claimed he was there. The Fickeys also didn't recall seeing Curtis Dunaway's car parked at the house until 8:45, which is over an hour after Tommy claimed he left the vehicle there. So the timelines of Tommy Zeigler, Edward Williams, and the Fickies all contradict one another, which means that either someone's memory is faulty or someone is lying. But in spite of these inconsistencies, the police do believe that Edward Williams and Felton Thomas are telling the truth, and they are certain that Tommy is lying and responsible for all 4 murders. Their theory is validated once they discover that Tommy has taken out 2 separate life insurance policies on Eunice in the preceding months and stands to collect $500,000 from her death. So here is the police's scenario for how they believe the murders went down. Their theory is that Tommy drove Eunice to the store between 7 and 7:30 and shot her in the back of the head as she was entering the kitchen. Perry and Virginia Edwards drove to the store separately and parked their sedan outside, but Tommy proceeded to shoot both of them once they entered the store. At some point, Perry tried to put up a fight, so Tommy bashed him across the head with a metal linoleum crank. A bullet damaged a clock inside the store and caused it to stop at 7:24, so at least one of the murders probably took place at this exact time. Shortly thereafter, Charlie Mays and Felton Thomas arrive at the store, and Tommy drives them to the orange grove to fire off the 3 guns. You see, there's apparently a twisted logic to this whole situation. Tommy has just used these guns to commit the murders, and now wants to get Mays and Thomas's fingerprints on them. He also wants to get gunshot residue on the 2 men's hands, so he can frame them for his crime. Tommy then drives them back to the store, and asks Thomas to turn off the power, possibly so he can get Thomas's fingerprints on the electrical switch. Tommy then decides to use a pipe to smash a window so that it will create the illusion of a break-in. Tommy's next step is to drive Mays and Thomas back to his home, where Edward Williams is waiting for him. After convincing Williams to wait for him a little longer, he grabs a box of ammunition and asks Mays to reload the guns, presumably to add more credence to his frame-up job. When they return to the furniture store, Tommy tries to lure Mays and Thomas inside, but Thomas gets scared and takes off, a decision which saves his life. Once Mays enters the store, Tommy shoots him and beats him to death with the linoleum crank, possibly because Mays put up a struggle. He then stuffs cash and store receipts inside Mays' pocket to make it look like he was killed while attempting a robbery. Afterwards, Tommy drives back to his house to meet Williams, and they return to the store in Williams' pickup truck. When the 2 men walk inside, Tommy tries to shoot Williams with the same .38 he used to shoot the Edwardses, but his gun either jams or he does not realize that it's out of bullets. When Williams runs out the back door, Tommy tries to lure him back inside and convince him that everything's okay by handing over the .38, but Williams escapes anyway. So now, Tommy's original plan to kill both Charlie Mays and Edward Williams and frame them for the murders has gone awry. So in order to make his cover story look more convincing, Tommy creates a self-inflicted gunshot wound by using one of the .38s to fire a bullet into his abdomen. He then calls the police and shares his story about being attacked by intruders. The police were now certain that Tommy Zeigler was the guilty party, so on December 29th, 5 days after the crime took place, he was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. So what evidence did they have against him? Well, aside from the testimony of Edward Williams and Felton Thomas, there was a witness named Thomas Hale who knew Tommy and Eunice and claimed he saw them both in the same car together at an intersection near the furniture store at 7:15 on Christmas Eve. Which, if true, totally blows apart Tommy's story. There was also a witness named Barbara Woodard, who drove by the furniture store sometime between 7:30 and 8:30 and said she saw a white man standing directly behind the store's glass doors. Even though it was too dark to positively identify him, the woman did know Tommy Zeigler personally and thought it might be him. Again, Tommy's story would not allow him to be seen by the store's entrance during this particular time period. And then there's the evidence at the murder scene. When she was found, Eunice's hand was in her coat pocket, which suggested to investigators that she was shot by someone she knew. They found it unlikely she'd keep her hand in her pocket if she had been surprised by an unknown assailant. When Tommy was taken to the hospital, he had a lot of blood on his shirt. But the problem was that Tommy's blood was type O, and it turned out that most of the blood on him was type A, which matched Perry Edwards' blood type. Since blood was found under his armpit, it was theorized that Tommy held Perry in a headlock while beating his skull with the metal crank, causing Perry's blood to spatter on him. When investigators examined Curtis Dunaway's car, they found what appeared to be reddish blood-like smears inside, along with tissue paper with a blood-like stain on it. There was also a .38 in the back of the car which was registered to Tommy, and he ordinarily kept it inside the furniture store. Authorities also recovered a hand towel from the sink in Tommy's garage, which he had apparently used to wipe potential blood evidence off Dunaway's car. All but 2 of the handguns found inside the furniture store were registered to Tommy, but the 2 unregistered guns were traced to a man named Frank Smith, who had purchased them from an Orlando pawn shop in June. And when Smith was tracked down, he actually claimed he had sold them to Tommy Zeigler back in June. However, Smith never actually met Zeigler face-to-face, and said he only spoke to him over the telephone. In fact, Edward Williams allegedly acted as their intermediary and personally delivered 2 guns to Zeigler. Corroborating testimony was also provided by Mary Ellen Stewart, who claimed she had recommended Smith to Zeigler when he expressed an interest in purchasing untraceable guns. And if you'll recall, Edward Williams was hiding out at Mary Ellen Stewart's place in Orlando when he turned himself into the police. But then there was the issue of motive. On the surface, Tommy had a pretty good motive since he stood to collect $500,000 in life insurance from Eunice's death. Yet the problem here was that Tommy was already pretty wealthy. Remember how I said earlier that the Zeigler family was worth over $1 million at that time? In the majority of these cases where someone murders their spouse to collect life insurance, the perpetrator is often experiencing serious financial issues at the time. But that was certainly not the case with Tommy Zeigler. And even if he did want to murder Eunice for the insurance money, why murder her parents as well? Well, the police got a bit of an answer when Eunice's brother, Perry Edwards Jr., traveled down from Georgia. This piece of information was not revealed publicly for several decades, but Perry Edwards Jr. was friends with the lead investigator, Don Fry, and served as his confidential informant. According to Perry Jr., his parents didn't travel to Winter Garden just because they wanted to spend the holidays with Eunice. They were planning to take her back home after she ended her marriage with Tommy. You see, Tommy was apparently a closet homosexual who had affairs with other men. Once these rumors got out, one of Eunice's friends came forward with a story about how Eunice had caught Tommy in bed with another man. When someone is charged with murder, it's usually inevitable that all sorts of unsavory rumors about them start surfacing in the community. Stories started spreading throughout Winter Garden about how Tommy had always been this stone-cold psychopath who liked to torture animals and had once cut off the leg of the family dog when he was a kid. They said that Mrs. Zeigler was this domineering mother and that Tommy had once tried to drown his own father right in front of her and she did nothing to stop him. During his testimony at the preliminary hearing, Don Fry gave this priceless quote. "This is the type of pattern of a man who is brought up by a passive father and a dominant mother. There are rumors going around that Tommy Zeigler is a homosexual. I haven't been able to prove or disprove that. You will note that each of these men were beaten, but none of the women are. Why is this so? Schools that I have been to say that this act can be interpreted as that of a homosexual, a man trying to be bisexual. During the time he committed the beatings, all inside him, he was saying, 'I am a man. You see, I'm a man. I've got power.' This can also be considered as retaliation of the mother, trying to break from the mother." Of course, it's somewhat convenient that no one ever heard any of these horror stories about Tommy until after he was charged with multiple murders, and no one has ever found any evidence that Tommy conducted homosexual affairs, or tortured animals, or tried to drown his father. It was nothing more than hearsay, as everyone who shared those rumors would say they heard them somewhere, but no one ever corroborated any of these stories. But in spite of some intriguing circumstantial evidence, there was no smoking gun per se against Tommy Zeigler. The Winter Garden police sent many pieces of forensic evidence to the FBI laboratories for examination, but since the FBI had a huge backlog at the time, the police did not get the results back until after Tommy was indicted and received his preliminary hearing. When the results arrived, the police were somewhat disappointed. Gunshot residue was found on the hands of Charlie Mays, Virginia Edwards, and Perry Edwards, but no trace of gunshot residue was found on the pants Tommy Zeigler wore that night, which seems pretty strange if he fired off 28 shots. Even though most of the guns found at the murder scene could be tied to Tommy, there were no usable fingerprints on any of them. A slug was found in the orange grove where Felton Thomas claimed that he and Charlie Mays had fired off Tommy's guns, but it could not be tied to any of the murder weapons. There were bloody shoe prints in the store which could not be matched to Tommy. The tests on the alleged blood smears and tissue paper inside Dunaway's vehicle and the hand towel from Tommy's garage all came back inconclusive. It also turned out that the .38 found in the back of Dunaway's car had never been fired. But in spite of all this, the state still decided to go to trial. For his defense, Tommy hired attorneys Vernon Davids and Terry Hadley, and it's worth noting that these two have remained loyal to him for the past 40 years. In order to remember more details from the night of the murders, Tommy's lawyers asked him if he would be willing to take the drug Brevitol sodium, which is essentially a form of truth serum. The doctor who administered this truth serum test flat out told Tommy that he would not be able to beat it if he was hiding something, but Tommy agreed to it anyway. And while he was under the influence of the drug, he told the exact same story about what happened that night, and provided more vivid details. In fact, you can actually watch the video of the entire session on YouTube. But even though Tommy passed the truth serum test, they have about the same legal weight as lie detector tests when it comes to being admissible as evidence, so the results would not be allowed to be presented at trial. And while we're on the subject of lie detector tests, I know they're not considered 100% reliable, but it should be noted that when Zeigler's story was being considered for unsolved mysteries during the 1990s, the producers of the show asked him to take a lie detector test without any attorneys present, and he passed that test as well. So let's move on to the trial, which had a lot of complications. And I'm just going to say this right up front. Regardless of whether you believe Tommy Zeigler's innocent or guilty, I'd say it's pretty clear-cut that he did not receive a fair trial. The prosecution did not exactly go out of its way to turn over all the evidence to Tommy's attorneys, so they really did not have enough time to prepare an adequate defense for trial. As an example, the defense wanted to test the pants Edward Williams turned over to the police to see if there were any traces of gunshot residue in the pockets, which might corroborate his story about Tommy giving him the murder weapon. Well, the prosecution took their sweet time turning the pants over to the defense, and by the time they got the pants tested and found out there were no traces of gunshot residue in the pockets, it was too late to use them as evidence at trial. But the biggest issue with the trial had to be the judge, Maurice Paul. Before I talk about him, I should provide some historical context about race relations in Winter Garden, Florida in 1975. Quite simply, they were not great, as the town was still fairly segregated at this time. In fact, one of the few upper-class white citizens who went out of his way to help the black community was Tommy Zeigler. For years, there were reports of a loan sharking operation in the area which targeted black migrant workers, and Tommy was very outspoken about this practice. So you can imagine how the black community felt when one of their biggest white supporters totally betrayed their trust by luring migrant worker Charlie Mays to his store, killing him, and attempting to frame him for the murders. But anyway, months before the murders took place, a local black bar owner named Andrew James was charged with selling marijuana to an undercover agent from the state beverage department, which put him in danger of losing his liquor license. Well, James is represented at trial by Terry Hadley, who says his client was railroaded because the loan sharking operation had been targeting his bar. Without hesitation, Tommy Zeigler agreed to act as a character witness for James at a time and a place when it was very unusual for a prominent white businessman to testify in favor of a black defendant. On the other side, the undercover beverage agent who allegedly bought marijuana from James, he had his own character witness, Judge Maurice Paul. In the end, James got to keep his liquor license and the agent was forced out of his job. Now, as you can imagine, it's very unusual for judges to testify as character witnesses at a trial, because this can be a very uncomfortable situation for the attorneys. I mean, it's got to be pretty awkward to pick apart a judge's testimony when the guy might be presiding over one of your trials sometime in the future. Well, that's exactly what happened to Tommy Zeigler and Terry Hadley. Zeigler and Paul had testified on opposing sides in another trial, Hadley had cross-examined the judge, and the entire case played a role in forcing one of Paul's friends out of his job. And now, Judge Paul was going to be presiding over Tommy Zeigler's murder trial. Naturally, the defense felt this was a major conflict of interest, and made numerous requests for Judge Paul to recuse himself, but he denied all these motions. If you look over the trial as a whole, it's obvious that Paul was pretty biased in favor of the prosecution, and the defense was at a considerable disadvantage. So let's discuss how the defense tried to counter the prosecution's evidence. One of the main issues was the state of the blood on Tommy's shirt surrounding his gunshot wound. The state's theory was that Tommy had shot himself in the abdomen immediately before, during, or after he made the phone call to Chief Fickey. It only took about 3 minutes to the police arrive after the call, yet there are many reports which state that the blood on Tommy's shirt was already dry. This would suggest that the wound was made long before he made the phone call, adding credence to Tommy's story that he had been shot and passed out for a considerable amount of time. Given the inherent risk of bleeding to death, the defense's argument was that it would make no sense for Tommy to shoot himself until after he finished the phone call, in which case, the blood would not have already been dry by the time the police arrived. Furthermore, Tommy had been shot with one of the .38s. If the gunshot wound was self-inflicted, why wouldn't he have used one of the .22s found at the murder scene, which created far less risk of inflicting serious damage? It's also worth noting that the physician who examined Tommy after the murders did testify that there was a lump on the back of his head, which seemed to corroborate his story about being attacked by intruders. So what about the fact that Tommy's holster was found on top of Mays' dried blood spatters? Well, one of the patrolmen testified to seeing the holster in a different spot when he originally entered the store. So it's possible that in all that darkness, someone could have accidentally kicked or moved the holster so that it wound up on top of the dried blood. A lot was made about the fact that Tommy had his father-in-law's type A blood on his shirt, but here's something strange. Neither Edward Williams nor Felton Thomas mentioned seeing any blood on Tommy's shirt, even though they both interacted with him after he supposedly beat and murdered Perry Edwards. The murder weapon, which Williams turned over to the police, Tommy claimed that the .38 was stolen from his trucks 2 weeks before the murders, and Williams did have access to that truck. Virginia Edwards had separate bullets from both the .38 and one of the .22s in her. It didn't make much sense that Tommy would use 2 different guns to kill his elderly mother-in-law, so this suggested that there were multiple shooters involved. And there were signs which pointed to an actual robbery taking place in the furniture store. 2 diamond rings, which Eunice usually wore, were not listed among the evidence, and even though Tommy's father had allegedly given her $40 that night, no money was found on her. Weeks later, Tommy's parents would claim that $800 in cash and other valuables from the store were unaccounted for. But here's perhaps the biggest hole in the state's case. As you know, Felton Thomas claimed that Tommy drove him and Charlie Mays to an orange grove and convinced them to fire off his guns. According to the prosecution, Tommy was trying to get their fingerprints on the murder weapons and gunshot residue on their hands. The main problem with this theory? All the guns found at the murder scene had been wiped clean of fingerprints. If Thomas's story was true, then Tommy had completely negated his entire plan by wiping off the fingerprints of the 2 people he was planning to frame. Furthermore, Perry and Virginia Edwards were both shot with a .38 which was registered to Tommy, not with any of the untraceable guns he had allegedly gone to the trouble of purchasing. Quite simply, this seemed like one of the sloppiest, most illogical murder plots ever concocted. So now let's move on to the state's witnesses. First, there's Thomas Hale, the witness who claimed he saw Tommy and Eunice driving to the furniture store in the same car together at 7:15 that night. Well, in response, the defense called a few character witnesses who said that Hale had a tendency to stretch the truth, and that he was the type of guy who would lie about things just to make himself the center of attention. In addition, one of the defense investigators claimed he showed Hale a photo of a vehicle and asked if it was the same car Tommy and Eunice were driving that night. Hale said yes, but the problem is that the vehicle in the photo was a car that the Zeiglers had sold 3 months before the murders. The defense also attempted to damage the credibility of Frank Smith and Mary Ellen Stewart, who were both allegedly involved in helping Tommy Zeigler purchase untraceable guns. Well, it turns out that Stewart was a frequent customer at the furniture store who was notorious for falling behind on her payments, and Zeigler had actually visited her home on one occasion to repossess some furniture. So that might give Stewart a motive to lie. It's also worth noting that when they turned themselves into the police following the murders, neither Edward Williams nor Mary Ellen Stewart mentioned anything about Zeigler using them to purchase untraceable guns in their original statements. This information did not even surface until days before the trial started. Other than the statements of Williams, Stewart, and Smith, there was nothing that could definitively tie Zeigler to any of those guns. However, the most interesting part of the defense's case was when they started opening up potentially sizable holes in Edward Williams' story about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. Even though Williams claimed he had climbed over a chain-link fence to escape from Zeigler, the shoes he provided to the police looked brand new and did not have any signs of scuff marks on them. As you'll recall, Williams claimed that he ran into a Kentucky Fried Chicken across the street and attempted to phone the police. Most of the witnesses who saw him described him as wearing a brown jacket, brown sweater, and brown slacks. Yet the clothing Williams provided to the police hours later was a black sweater and dark green pants. If these were not the same clothes Williams wore to the furniture store, this might explain why no traces of gunshot residue were found in his pockets. But here's the really intriguing part. If you look at Williams' timeline, his interactions with Zeigler at the furniture store should have taken place at around 8:40, 8:45 or so. Yet most of the witnesses who saw Williams at the KFC placed him there well after 9 o'clock. Of course, eyewitnesses can often get their times wrong, but 2 of the accounts really stood out. An elderly customer named Ed Nolan reported seeing a black man enter the KFC and asking to use the phone at approximately 9:20. Right afterward, Ed claims that he turned his head and saw his brother and sister-in-law J.D. and Madeline Nolan driving down the street where they narrowly avoided being sideswiped by a police car. J.D. and Madeline both corroborated this part and then said they parked their vehicle and walked over to the KFC to converse with Ed. Now here's where the 2 stories differentiate and the whole Rashomon Effect goes into play again. Ed Nolan claimed that the black man showed up to use the phone before J.D. and Madeline arrived, but J.D. and Madeline claimed that this black man asked to use the phone after they arrived at the KFC. So obviously, one of the Nolan brothers is incorrect about this particular detail, but here's the really interesting part. That police car which nearly sideswiped the Nolans, it was arriving at the furniture store to respond for Tommy Zeigler's call for assistance. Police logs show that the patrol car received the call for assistance at exactly 9:21. J.D. and Madeline would testify to seeing Tommy Zeigler being helped out of the furniture store right after they parked their car. So this would obviously confirm that the Nolans saw this black man at the KFC either right before or right after 9:21. Either Ed or J.D. might be mistaken about the exact time they saw the black man, but it would have been right around the same time the police arrived. And if that black man was in fact Edward Williams, and I don't see how it couldn't be, this creates a huge hole in his story. If you follow Williams' timeline, then it somehow took him between 30 to 40 minutes to run directly across the street from the furniture store to the KFC after Zeigler tried to kill him. That makes no sense whatsoever. This should have been a major coup for the defense. They did get J.D. and Madeline Nolan to testify at the trial, but there was an unfortunate situation with Ed Nolan. Ed was dying of cancer at the time, and while he lived long enough to provide a deposition at the preliminary hearing, he passed away before the trial. Technically, the defense could have used Ed's deposition as evidence at the trial, but they would have to read his original testimony word for word. And why was that a problem? Well, at one point, while describing the black man he saw, Ed Nolan used the N-word, and since half the jurors at the trial were black, the defense feared that Ed Nolan's racial slur ran the risk of alienating them, so they ultimately decided not to use it. And unfortunately, J.D. and Madeline Nolan's testimony just did not seem to have as much impact without Ed's corroboration. Anyway, the case finally went to the jury, and they went 2 days without reaching a verdict. During deliberations, a juror named Irma Brickle had the bailiff send a note to Judge Paul, asking for a meeting to express some concern she had. Paul refused to see her, fearing that it might threaten the integrity of the jury and cause a potential mistrial. Now, years later, Brickle would reveal that when deliberations started, the jury was split 6-6. However, the foreman announced right from the outset that he believed Zeigler was guilty, and nothing was going to change his mind. As deliberations went on, the jurors who felt Zeigler was guilty pretty much intimidated and bullied the others into changing their vote until Brickle was the lone holdout. At this point, the handguns from the murder scene were inside the jury room to be viewed as evidence, and apparently, the bullying got so bad that a juror picked up one of the empty revolvers, held it up against Brickle's head, and pulled the trigger. Brickle began to fall ill and fainted on at least 2 occasions. Once word of this reached Judge Paul, he ordered Brickle's physician to prescribe her some Valium. And once this happened, the medication pretty much broke Brickle's will and prompted her to change her vote. The jury found Tommy Zeigler guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. But the shadiness surrounding this trial did not even end there. At this point, there was a moratorium on the death penalty in the U.S. because the Supreme Court had declared it to be unconstitutional. Well, by sheer coincidence, on the very same day this case went to the jury, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty could be reinstated in the state of Florida. When the jury deliberated on Zeigler's sentencing, they recommended life imprisonment. But then, Judge Paul decided to overrule the recommendation. Since Florida can now use the death penalty again, he decided to sentence Tommy Zeigler to death by the electric chair. And I'm sorry, folks, but I'm afraid I will have to leave you on this cliffhanger. Next week's episode will be part 2 of the Tommy Zeigler case, in which I will be presenting a lot of major developments which have occurred in the years following his conviction, as well as provide my own personal analysis. But fear not, you will only have to wait 1 week instead of the usual 2 to hear the conclusion of the story. Trust me, it will be well worth the wait. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. robin.warder@icloud.com. Also, be sure to check out The Trail Went Cold on Facebook and Twitter. We're now available for download on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Music, so be sure to leave us a rating or a review at any of these places, because that will help us garner more exposure. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide the obligatory shout-out to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, a big shout-out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So have yourself a good 2 weeks. Nope, scratch that. Have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday to hear the conclusion of this story on a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.